Good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to invite such a distinguished Pauline theologian, Dr. Douglas Campbell, to the University of College of Theology and Yonsei University. My name is Song Lim. I'm an associate professor of New Testament and associate dean of College of Theology. And let me just introduce Professor Campbell. Professor Campbell was born in London, England, but was raised in New Zealand. And he did his undergraduate degree in political philosophy at the University of Otago in New Zealand. And his graduate degree is MA and PhD at the University of Toronto in Canada. He taught at several universities, but currently he's teaching at Duke Divinity School as professor of New Testament. And Professor Campbell's main research interest is the life and theology of the Apostle Paul, with particular reference to an understanding of salvation informed by apocalyptic as against justification or salvation history. And he has written so many books and articles, but his main books will include Pauline Dogmatics, Paul, an Apostle Journey, and Framing Paul, Non-Expository Biography, and the like. Let me welcome Dr. Campbell. He will give us about 45-minute lecture, and we'll have about 10-minute break, and we'll have about 1 hour discussion. Okay, let us welcome Dr. Campbell.
Thank you so very much for that lovely introduction and for this invitation. I do appreciate it. Your hospitality has been quite charming. So, my paper is called The Deepest Secret, Paul's Radical Missional Theology. Start in section 1 with the introduction, Paul's inclusive mission. I want to begin by laying down an explanatory marker in relation to Paul's theology, to which we will return in due course, namely the pagan mission. We're so familiar with the Paul of the church that we tend to forget how shockingly inclusive his missionary program amongst the pagans living in the Roman Empire was when it first eventuated. The communities of Jesus' followers that he succeeded in founding, which was an achievement in and of itself, were clearly ethical, well, they were supposed to be. But his letters also attest to the way in which these former pagans were not ethical in a standard Jewish way, which is why his converts were first called Christians at Antioch by the mocking Roman authorities, as Acts notes in an impressively accurate historical aside. That's in 1126. Some important Jewish practices like aniconic worship are apparent in the new communities, but these are present alongside a puzzling disregard toward other key Jewish activities like dietary and calendrical rules and the circumcision of males. Unsurprisingly, these radical innovations resulted in serious contestation among the Jewish leadership of the early church. Nevertheless, in cutting a long story short, Paul did succeed in justifying his innovative approach, at least to some. And so pagans continued to convert and to become Christians, not Jews, with the result that Paul's theological rationale for his radical mission became the basis for a radically inclusive church, comprising both Torah-observant Messianic Jews and suitably purified converts from paganism, who continued to be known in distinction from the former, at least for a time, as Christians. It follows that Paul's explanation for this odd arrangement is inordinately important and contested. Nevertheless, I am going to argue in what follows that participationist eschatology, suitably defined, maps its key contours accurately, a rubric I'm drawing from E.P. Sanders. And I'm making this claim over against competing claims, most especially a certain sort of Lutheran construct, as Stendhal rather unfortunately identified it. Having said this, I emphasize pneumatology more than Sanders did, and argue here further that Paul is drawing on Hellenistic categories, although in all probability these were mediated to him by the hybridized Judaism within which he was raised and educated. So let's talk for a while about participationist eschatology. So the summary phrase, participationist eschatology, captures the importance to Paul of resurrection and eschatology, notions discussed at length in much Jewish apocalyptic literature, although many other texts from the late Second Temple period address them as well, and they do not all say the same thing. Somewhat unusually, however, against this backdrop, Paul, inspired by the risen Jesus, appeals repeatedly to inaugurated eschatology, which is to say, to a resurrection operative in some sense within his converts already, in advance of the universal cosmic arrival of the age to come, in which they participate. It is this participation that undergirds their nature, status, and behavior as Christians, rather than, although not over against, Messianic Jews. Hence, although Paul is, to be sure, waiting for further dramatic future eschatological events and speaks not infrequently of their arrival, it is the inaugurated present eschatology that does the heavy lifting in his ethic. So I recommend holding present and future eschatology together when reconstructing his thinking, rather than subordinating the former to the latter, and also emphasizing the ongoing importance of the present aspect within this eschatological thinking by using the signifier participationist or some such. The life of Paul's converts is already resurrected in some concrete sense, is stated especially clearly in 2 Corinthians 5:17 and Galatians 6:15. But important summaries of their transfer into this resurrected life, as enacted by an entry ritual of immersion, now known as baptism, can also be found in, amongst other places, Galatians 3:26 through 28, 1 Corinthians 12:13, and Colossians 3:11. So I'll just read one of these. So then, if someone is in Messiah, he is a new creation. The old has gone. Strictly speaking, I should translate this, all things have become new. Love that text. So jump across to page 9. The claims of these short summaries can then be found writ large through important arguments like Romans chapters 5 through 8. And they are presupposed whenever Paul exhorts his converts to act ethically and yet does not enforce full Torah observance, as, for example, throughout 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and Philemon. Paul's own preferred summary for this state, used through all his letters, is the phrase "in Christ," or its close equivalent, which I would now prefer, following Matt Novinson's work, to translate as "in Messiah." I'm not going to do it today, but I would, given time. This phrase occurs in Paul's extant letters upward of 150 times, and we will revisit this notion in more detail momentarily. The apostles' claim in all these locations is that Jesus' followers, whether Christian converts or Messianic Jews, live now out of and on the basis of a resurrected location that transcends current visible structures of ethnicity, race, class, status, and even gender. There is no male and female, he says famously on one occasion. Such categories that belong to the current cosmos are no longer determinative. Paul and his converts live from a new world, which is to say, from the new creation. Furthermore, this new location is dramatically superior to the old. This superiority is clearest in a brief comparison undertaken in Philippians 3, where Paul contrasts his previous life with life now in Messiah. But whatever was gained to me, these things I consider loss because of the Messiah. Furthermore, I also consider everything to be loss because of the sheer unsurpassing nature of the knowledge of Messiah, Jesus my Lord. Because of whom everything has become a loss. I consider them rubbish that I might gain Messiah, and that I might be found in him. Now, Paul's point here can be blunted by an overly polite translation. I hope I'm not going to completely discredit myself at this moment. I am going to be slightly impolite. He looks back on his previous life, because Paul's being impolite. Paul looks back on his previous life, good in and of itself, or gain as he puts it, and he characterizes it in comparison to his present life within the resurrected Messiah as scivola, or excrement, which is to say that this new location transcends current structures, including ethnicity, and does so massively, as much as a celebratory dinner surpasses what happens later in the toilet. Although it is critical to remember that this is a relative, not an absolute comparison. It seems fair to conclude initially then that it is the overwhelming presence and value of an in-breaking resurrected location that both directs Paul's life and justifies the existence of his pagan converts as Christians, not Jews. Now, a minority tradition of scholars has long recognized and affirmed this account of the center of Paul's theology. Its most famous forebear is Albert Schweitzer, although by his own admission, he drew on important earlier antecedents. My beloved teacher of blessed memory, Richard Longnecker, who also belongs to this tradition, looked back in particular to the seminal work of Adolf Deismann and notes the transmission of this position through key British scholars like James Stewart and James Denny. They're both Scots. W.D. Davies is a Welshman. C.F.D. Moule and Morna Hooker are both English. Vrader's name could also be included here, although many of these participatory scholars arguably lack the eschatological frame that Schweitzer identified so accurately. Hence, in a particularly important moment, the full Schweitzerian position was reaffirmed in 1977 by E.P. Sanders in his epochal Paul and Palestinian Judaism, using the summary rubric I began with here of participationist eschatology. It's worth noting in passing that Sanders' restatement has been developed still further by other scholars, for example, by his pupil, Greg Tatum, who introduces the faithfulness of Christ and a more extensive role for the divine spirit, motifs that Sanders was uncomfortable with. I myself would want to add that Paul operates with a hybridized pneumatology that has been informed helpfully by Stoic as well as by Jewish insights. The divine spirit for Paul in a Stoic sense is that especially fine dimension of the divinity that spreads into and animates all things, permeating them at the most subtle level, generating their particular bodiliness, both connecting and distinguishing them. It is the action of God's Spirit, then, that connects Paul and his converts subtly, deeply, but concretely with the risen Messiah, shaping them into Jesus' image. Platonism might be doing some work here as well. Now, admittedly, Paul's claims that he and his converts are participating to a significant degree in the age to come, and so are characterized primarily by resurrection and a resulting new creation, are counterintuitive, to put the objection mildly. But he was well aware of this. He does not deny that life in the present cosmos continues. The resurrection is only as yet partial, so to speak. As he puts it once, we walk by believing and not by seeing, which is to admit that what his converts continue to see is the world of the flesh. So here, anticipating Richard Rorty, a certain sort of ocular information must be rejected. However, Paul is certain that they have a comprehensively renewed mind derived ultimately from Jesus. They now possess Jesus's phronema, which is to say his intentions and judgments gifted by the divine pneuma. Hence, Paul's proclamation of this reality is accompanied by confirming signs and wonders, while his converts' worship evidences more of the same. These warrants suffice to reassure his followers that the spiritual world that they are involved with is quite real, and that the story Paul recounts about what has happened to them is an accurate one. And ancient people were much less resistant, in any case, to the existence of this unseen world than modern Western individuals are. These demonstrations would have been more about the power of the divinity being proclaimed rather than the existence of an unseen spiritual world per se. How many Koreans believe in the existence of a world of spirit and spirits today? Is that still something around, or is everybody completely secular? Americans don't believe in it. Okay, so Jesus' followers live with a foot in two worlds, and the apparent reality of the one must not be allowed to occlude the underlying determinative reality of the other. A metaphysical situation Luther later developed insightfully in terms of the simul, and I found sonic and musical phenomena very helpful for thinking about this interpenetrating situation as well, and I would recommend reading Jeremy Begbie on that. Now I'm going to skip section 3, where I'm arguing that Paul is not a Gnostic. So remember that. Paul, not Gnostic, believes in bodies. Jump to section 4 on page 18. To summarize my argument to this point, Paul maintains that Jesus' followers participate in a new, more serene location of spirit. And this eschatological transformation, which is currently unfolding within Paul's communities, is not merely salvific, although it is this, it is ethical. In the first instance, the new resurrected mind simply possesses a capacity that the mind of the flesh lacks. In the past, Jesus' followers were slaves to seductive lusts living within and to evil powers oppressing from without. And they were frequently unaware even of what the good was, not to mention hostile to God. But now they can do the good that previously they could not do, provided, that is, they do not slip back as they work out their ethics into a foolish battle with the flesh in the manner that Romans 7 depicts. But it is not enough simply to affirm that converts have already been raised in some sense in the Messiah with the help of God's Spirit, which are the usual claims of Paul's participatory interpreters. Grasping this basis for Paul's theology is a critical first step. But we still need to ask, second, what this partially inaugurated eschatological existence is actually like as people start to live in it, since this new reality supplies the all-important ethical dynamics that press in upon the renewed minds of those who have drunk the Spirit. What are its contours? What exactly are we participating in? And at this moment, I want to suggest that certain categories derived from key figures within the church's tradition enable us to see dynamics operating within Paul's participationist eschatology that perhaps we could not see before when we looked upon it with overly historicizing eyes. In particular, certain Trinitarian reflections on the nature of the person will ultimately prove helpful, although we will need to develop these a little before we can grasp their full significance. A person, John Zizioulas suggests, in heavy dependence on the Cappadocians, should be understood in marked opposition to most of the self-contained and individualistic conceptions dominating modernity, particularly Western modernity, not so much Asian modernity. In ecstatic terms, meaning by this that people exist in relation to one another. They exist primarily and at first only as those relationships exist and through those relationships, and so, quote, outside of themselves, unquote. Hence, as Zizioulas puts this in a puckish wordplay, the hypostasis or nature of a person consists of ekstasis. Hypostasis, the being under, consists of ekstasis, being that goes out. So it's a pun on the Greek. It's a good one. All right. It's worth taking a moment to ground these potential insights in the concrete. In my case, I'm the married partner of Rachel and the parent of Rupert and Georgia. Hence, as a result of our covenantal relationships with one another, which have been reinforced In so many ways over the years, to speak in Zazeulian terms, these three people are part of who I am, and I of them. Where I go, Rachel, Rupert, and Georgia go, and where they go, I go too. Our personhood is intertwined together, which is why when trauma happens to one of them, it happens to me, and vice versa. Although the same also applies to positive experiences of excitement and joy. Their joy is my joy is their joy. From a Trinitarian purview, then, I can see that I am indeed constituted primarily by my relationships, and especially by my key connections, whether these are within my families or with my deepest friends. Although the network of relationships that define me are by no means limited to these connections, I'm defined by many further networks, including by my enemies. I need to add the two caveats immediately. First, that no families transmit covenantal relationality perfectly, while tragically, some families are horrifically destructive to them. And second, we're not dissolved entirely into our relationships. An individuated dimension remains present. Individuated, not individual. Nevertheless, I would want to affirm that at their best, familial relations along with close friendships mediate relationality and hence constitute personhood effectively, constructively, and even at times delightfully. Because we are persons who are constituted relationally, we participate in one another. Now, I recently rediscovered from my undergraduate days what is surely one of the best articulations of these insights ever penned, strictly speaking, typed, by E.E. Cummings, who used to type his poetry. I carry your heart with me, I carry it in my heart. I am never without it. Anywhere I go, you go, my dear. And whatever is done by only me is your doing, my darling. I fear no fate, for you are my fate, my sweet. I want no world, for beautiful you are my world, my true. And it's you are whatever a moon has always meant, and whatever a sun will always sing is you. Here is the deepest secret nobody knows. Here is the root of the root and the bud of the bud and the sky of a tree called life, which grows higher than soul can hope or mind can hide. And this is the wonder that's keeping the stars apart. I carry your heart. I carry it in my heart. Now, the relational dimension of persons deeply intertwined in love could hardly be stated more clearly, not to mention beautifully. And Cummings also utilizes the local metaphor for intimacy in terms of inness that is so important for Paul, that we noted earlier. To be relational and to love is to be a part of one another. On a slightly less poetic note, we might register the way that this insight into the nature of personhood dovetails with recent research on infant development, supported by advances in neuroscience and by complementary work being done within the interdisciplinary field known as the second personal. And Susan Eastman, my colleague, has done a wonderful job exploring that in her book, Paul and the Person. Highly recommend that book. Paul's account of the divine nature, as well as of personhood in general, often articulates its relational dimension once one knows where to look for it. Paul's favorite but often unexplained appellation for one of the divine figures is God the Father. I would want to emphasize immediately that for Paul, this gender designation is grounded in intertextuality, not in biology. Paul is claiming here, amongst other things, that God the Father acts like Abraham the father, who in Genesis 22 does not spare his own son, while in like manner, Jesus, like Isaac, Abraham's son, obediently, faithfully accepts his awful fate. Consequently, the signifiers father and son do not for Paul denote gender, as they point to divine figures who transcend gender categories. They denote actors and roles within a scriptural story that Paul uses to interpret the cross. But this story does thereby also denote that relationality lies at the very heart of the persons of the Father and the Son. God the Father is identified fundamentally here by his relationship with his Son. This defines who he is, just as the Son is defined by the fact that he is the Son, which is to say that he has this Father, a point that the author of the fourth gospel has grasped with complete clarity. Smart guy. In the light of these disclosures about the nature of the persons whom Paul worships as divine, it is perhaps easier to see than it was before why familial metaphors are so fundamental to Paul's account of community, yet again in a way that transcends gender. Paul's preferred appellation for Jesus' followers by far is adelphi, resurrected, eschatological, adelphi, usually translated brothers, but better translated, I think, siblings, a designation complemented by tekna, children, in the Greek. Paul summarizes many of these insights especially clearly in Romans 8:29. Those whom God the Father foreknew, he appointed beforehand to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he, Jesus, might be the firstborn among many siblings. If this relational notion of personhood is starting to bed down, then we need to consider next what the tenor or quality of these relationships is, since this will generate the particulars of his ethic. Okay, tenor. So relational ethics. I mentioned earlier in passing that good relationships are covenantal, meaning by this that they are in a certain sense unconditional. Good relationships, at least ideally, never break and are never withdrawn. To speak personally again, my children will always be my children, and I will always be their parent. No matter how much one of us wishes this was not the case, nothing that they or I do can alter this. These relationships can be damaged, to be sure, and even be the source of a great deal of pain, but they are irrevocable. And when they are operating as they should, they result in a great deal of joy. Should add my grandchildren in there now. That's very important. And Paul says just the same thing about God's relationship with the church in Romans 8 and with Israel in Romans 11. But underlying the covenantal nature of these relationships is a more fundamental relational dynamic that Paul knows well. The relationships within the divine community, so to speak, are relationships of love. This love should not be defined in terms of the sentimentality that modern culture frequently confuses it with. Thinking here of our conversation at lunch about K-pop. It's probably not the right place to go. Real love is revealed ultimately by Jesus' determined walk to the cross while humanity was still abusive and hostile. It is, if necessary, painfully vulnerable and unyieldingly faithful. It endures shame, distress, and fear without recourse to violence, thereby demonstrating a strength that few of our current leaders possess or even understand. But it also operates in a specific way, shifting modalities as it encounters different circumstances. So, as Paul puts it on one occasion, relationships informed by love can be as they need to be, patient, kind, and affirming of others. They can be delighting, hopeful, persevering, and they also evidence, when it is appropriate, joy, peace, generosity, gentleness, and self-control. This then, in brief, is the heart of Paul's ethic. The relationships between Father and Son, and I think by implication with the Spirit, draw Paul's converts into a communion, thereby transforming them into a covenantal and loving way of relating. Eschatology is relationality. Paul would not have put things in quite this way, of course. For him, this was the arrival of the age to come, heaven above, breaking into our present situation, God's Spirit gifting God's followers with a new mind imaged by the risen Jesus. But the different language denotes the same loving relational reality, which then in turn explains almost everything Paul enjoins on his converts ethically in his disparate letters. The quality of the relating is what ultimately matters. Paul, like Augustine after him, was an agapeist. Now, 1 Corinthians is a useful quick test case for this admittedly rather bold claim. So we'll whip through that quickly. Love is incarnational. It gets alongside people irrespective of their status, so community leaders should evidence this in terms of who they get alongside and convert. They should abandon rather than pursue cultural capital. Moreover, it does not get involved in overzealous partisanship, aggressively promoting certain leaders at the expense of others. That's 110 through 421. It undertakes sexual activity within certain boundaries, outside of which damage ensues, chapter 5, chapter 6, chapter 7. Love resolves communal disputes like thefts internally, chapter 6, as well as restoratively. 2 Corinthians is brought here into view, chapters 2 and chapter 7. When someone is offended by the breach of a dietary practice, the offender prescinds from eating the offending article again, however theologically innocuous it might be, chapters 8 through 10. When people are worshipping in a way that shames their spouses, they should modify their behavior accordingly, chapter 11. When people are being humiliated by the largesse some enjoy at the communal meal, that ostentatious behavior is to cease, chapter 11 again. When people are crowding out the spiritually inspired voices of one another, they are to slow down and take turns, and especially when those voices are coming from people whom society generally overlooks or silences. Love recommends the involvement of others in a community selflessly, giving money, chapter 16, and gives money to those who need it. In short, attention to the quality of the relationships involved in each of these situations, with the goal of making them as loving as possible, does explain most of what Paul is urging through this, his most complex pastoral letter. Indeed, I would argue that it explains the bulk of Paul's ethical advice in all of his letters. It does not explain everything, and at such moments we should call Paul himself, or at least his texts, to account. But in the main, it remains true that Paul exhorts his converts in a variety of ways to relate to one another with the appropriate sensitivity and kindness, ultimately with a Jesus-like love. So, if we appreciate that participation in an inaugurated eschatological reality that is primarily interpersonal results in a fundamentally relational ethic, with loving and covenantal behavior issuing forth from that new constitutive location within the divine communion, then we're ready to return to the critical story we began with. So this is a critical, pivotal point in the paper. I'm going to make some moves. I started this paper by recalling briefly the radical nature of Paul's mission to the pagans that resulted in Christians rather than in yet more Messianic Jews. And what is now possible to see after our investigation of its conceptual underpinnings is that this is really important. This was not a process of erasure, with one constituency eliminating the other in view of its self-evident inadequacies. That's the kind of colonial move, which is what the main competing account of Paul's program in Lutheran terms ultimately suggests. I'm saying that is wrong. It was a legitimate and appropriate diversification by way of various acts of concrete inclusion that were justified by a relational ethic. Now, I would love to talk more about the contextual origins of this inclusive ethic, but that would take us too far afield. Suffice it to say, I don't think Paul worked all this out in advance. He was confronted by a missional reality amongst his people, most likely by the overt presence of the Spirit within a group of worshipping God-fearers in Syrian Antioch. And this forced him to rethink his ethic in these more radical and inclusive terms. The key point for us to grasp at this moment, however, is that a relational ethic is concerned above all with the tenor and dynamics of the relationships within a new community, as against with its forms or structures. Hence, it allows many of those forms and structures to remain intact, even after conversion, and this explains the diversification. Structures belong to the present broken and passing age. Relationality belongs to the perfections of the age to come, and is what really matters. So mission should not be automatically erasing. Now, it will be in certain respects, because Paul is going to supply an account of sin, but I think it operates from a baseline of cultural affirmation. Now, structures still matter to a degree, and it is vital to appreciate both this fact and its status. All relationships operate within structures that contain multiple dimensions, providing options for individuated behavior. Structures are, after all, closely intertwined with our bodies, and we are embodied. Every act must unfold at some point through a body or bodies in order to take place. Try and do an act that isn't embodied. Just try it. Have a go. It's really difficult. But it is the relational tenor of the act that matters, because it is the relational tenor which reflects the dynamics of the age to come. So the Pauline disciple must ask of every act, and in fact of every structure, relational questions like these. Is it loving, if appropriate? Is it covenantal in the right circumstances? Is it gentle or kind or self-controlled or patient, and so on? And the easiest way to think about this, although it has some limitations, is to grasp that the how matters more than the what. If, in an act of kindness, I offer to get my co-worker a free beverage, it does not matter that much if she asks for a cup of coffee, of cocoa, or of tea. The act cannot take place without a concrete drink, but the what of the drink does not matter as much as the how of the offer and its delivery. Just so, Paul is not especially concerned when a former pagan is eating meat that has been previously sacrificed to an idol and not drained properly of its blood. But he knows that this what will scandalize some, so he counsels his converts not to cause offense. That's the how of the situation. If someone will be upset, or perhaps even completely undone, by seeing Jesus' followers feasting on such meat, then the feasters should determine never to eat meat again. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of food and drink, but of goodness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. If your sibling is grieved because of food, then you are no longer walking in love. With the how mattering more than the what, the stage is set for a diversification of the Jesus movement over time into different contexts. The structures and forms of the spreading networks may differ as long as the relationships operating within them are loving. It is vital to appreciate there is no trivialization of all these emerging differences, or of those that have been left behind. The embodied structures within which all relating takes place remain important, and for just the reasons that led us to repudiate Gnosticism earlier on, although I skipped that. Trust me, there are reasons. Paul's God is fully engaged with every aspect of human life and with what people do through and with their bodies. God is deeply interested in such things, in all the details. God loves the details. Without these structures, people cannot relate at all. But the nature of the divine engagement also matters. Such structures are expressions of particularity. Hence, they enable a delightfully diverse relational play to unfold within all the histories of different networks, peoples, and groups. As such, they are interesting and can even be fun, and they contribute to identity, but they are also merely the vehicle for relating. As the forms within which relating and acting play out, they do matter, but they matter primarily to their original practitioners. Hence, there's no warrant on the basis of these considerations for universalizing these forms and mandating them for everyone. That would be a grievous non sequitur. When I arrive and want to turn you into a Christian, I don't have to make you look like me. I need to learn how to look like you. That's the move. We get it wrong most of the time. So I myself like drinking a mug of hot tea in the morning made with loose leaf tea originally harvested in India. I hope I'm not causing offense by saying this. This is very much a part of who I am, and I'm strongly committed to this practice, as are others. But it is not a universally applicable ethical form to be applied in the name of God to everyone living around me who drinks coffee, water, or orange juice for breakfast. It's just something I do. And I learned to do it from my culture and my forebears, who are largely British and frequently do the same. Paul is deeply interested in the nature of the relationships playing out around my tea drinking, as is God. Am I generous with my offers of tea? Do I make tea for my spouse, perhaps even unbidden? Am I loving and generous? And eventually, of course, we must ask if the entire process by which the tea arrives on my bench is loving or at least fair. The answer being, after a due consideration of some of the nasty colonial dynamics involved, perhaps only a qualified yes. Hence, I try to drink tea when I'm in New Zealand, produced by a Sri Lankan company that is locally owned and operated. Just the same considerations apply to every action I undertake. Their relational tenor is of profound importance. The how matters ethically, but the what is merely important to me, and insofar as it impacts the how. Hence, just as Paul does not expect me to mandate tea drinking for all serious Jesus followers, he does not mandate Jewish structures for his converts either. His pagan converts do not need to eat or to drink like Jews, to dress like them, to rest like them on Saturdays, or even in the case of males, to undertake Jewish ritual bodily surgery. That's why we have Christians. But they do need to relate in ways that many Jews would have recognized as they lived in relationship to God and to one another. Hence, the disloyalties of idol worship must cease. Very important move here. However, in equal measure, none of these Jewish structures should be abandoned by Jews. Jesus' Jewish followers could, and in many respects should, remain entirely Torah observant, although carrying those structures forward in conversation with their relationality. There is room in a steadily diversifying church for all of these different arrangements as it spreads out from its original and ultimately from its most important constellation of Jewish practices. After all, only Jewish followers can lay claim to an entirely sacred history, including things like the scriptures, here unlike the pagans. Now, this type of ethical navigating in terms of an eschatological structure relationality distinction is a rule of thumb. It will need to be complicated and nuanced, and some caveats will need to be introduced straight away, which I don't have time to articulate here. So elsewhere in that book, I describe, after 4 modes of appropriate missional engagement, 4 distinguishable modes of contextual evaluation, accompanied by 4 modes of transformation. Ultimately, some structures do need to be reformed and some need to be abolished because they so distort the relationality that they mediate. So some things have to go. But within any contextual navigation, I would suggest the structure relationality distinction generally holds good. And the result of this flexible ethic at work is a fascinating diversification by the church through a series of missional navigations into different local communal expressions, all the while being guided, shaped, and informed by the appropriate relationality. Most importantly, then, there is on the one hand no absolute erasure of local identities and particularities in the name of one overarching normative cultural identity. But on the other hand, neither is there any libertine endorsement of all actions and structures as somehow equal and appropriate. There is a steady expansion and diversification as suitably trained missionary apostles engage sensitively and incarnationally with different contexts, along with all their diverse ways of doing things. Hence, as Paul basically says in Romans 11, we can see the early church spreading out from a root in the specific form of the Jewish people through its messianic variants, and then through different formerly pagan and now Christianized communities, whether those are Greek, Hellenistic, Roman, or some form inflected with barbarian culture, in Colossae perhaps Phrygian, and elsewhere possibly Galatian. Paul's mission established a network of steadily diversifying communities. It was a garden suitably purged of weeds where 1,000 flowers could bloom. It was an ongoing refraction of light into a rainbow church. Or it should have been. So, to conclude, hopefully enough has been said by now for us to grasp the relational basis of Paul's ethic, which both informed and legitimized the first dramatic diversification of the early church through his inclusive mission to the pagans. Inaugurated eschatology by way of a certain type of divinely endorsed relationality relativizes but does not erase present embodied structures, allowing the inclusion of multiple diverse structures within the broader church, although it presses into these structures with powerful relational claims, sifting and reshaping them appropriately. Slavery, it should be noted, did not finally survive this pressure, although it resisted it for far too long. Perhaps at this moment, then, we understand Paul's mission to the pagans a little more clearly than we did before, and also understand that it did not proceed by erasing Messianic Jews, or any Jews. And perhaps in tandem with this, we understand that Paul was an apostle who advocated a shockingly radical gospel of inclusion. He was, in a certain sense, the outrageous progressive in the early church. And I myself would go so far as to suggest that Paul's explanation of his pagan mission was a stunning theological achievement that the church ignores at its peril. But of course, it frequently does. Hence, at this closing moment, it is only appropriate to note that Paul's inclusive yet challenging ethic has a great deal more work still to do, and at times in defiance of some of his own statements. It remains necessary, that is, to subject the historical interpretation of Paul's texts to Paul's own Trinitarian ethic in Acts of Socratique, scrutinizing his original localized instructions in terms of the theological program that lies at the heart of his most important work, which was his inclusive mission to the pagans. We must, in other words, always step from the theology of Paul to Pauline theology, appreciating as we do so that Paul's own theological program demands that we do this. We have to do it. Paul's theology, properly understood, summons us both to go beyond him, continuing his hard work of inclusion and diversification, and to stand firm against its contestation, just as he did, ultimately at such a great cost. But then, perhaps as we enter into these sometimes hard struggles, whether as we reach out to invite the hostile to join us, or hold firm for the truths of the gospel against leaders who have lost sight of them, we will know in those places and in the relationships we find there, the deepest secret nobody knows. The root of the root, and the bud of the bud, and the sky of a tree called life, thereby knowing the wonder that's keeping the stars apart.